And I'm so pleased to introduce Kim Schwenk. Kim is rare book cataloger at UC San Diego Special Collections and Archives Library, and an antiquarian bookseller with Lux Mentis Booksellers. She has a specialization in Americana and European witchcraft history of early printed occult texts, and bibliographic studies of magical curses using plants and objects. She's also active in occult sciences and the occult book community, both as a researcher and a practitioner. And in 2019, as of 2019, she is researching occult ex libris, otherwise known as HEX libris or occult book plates. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Kim. Thanks so much, Kim.
Thank you, Erin. I hope everyone can hear me. And I want to give a big shout out to Erin and the BSA for this invitation to talk about occult identities and books and beyond. I hope you find something that resonates. I'm going to jam here because I have a lot to show you. My interest in the occult has been really a slow burn. It's something I've been fueling for a while. Professionally, I have this really unique position to work partially in the book trade and partially in a rare book library as a cataloger, which is a complex marriage and almost an alchemical wedding for me as I navigate the nuances of bibliographic description. It's really tricky to work in both, actually. As a bookseller, I can afford a lot of liberties in the book trade, and I tend to focus on controversial material and talk about why it's important in the context of the now or in the context of collection development. And to be truthful, and really in my stage of life of cataloging, I'm a baby cataloger, I'm an adolescent, but not really to occult studies. I do feel though, at this time, the time of neutrality is over, and the impetus to challenge problematic bibliographic description and collection development is active and activated. So this poses an interesting discussion about occult knowledge ownership, provenance, but more critically, how individuals have dictated the evolution of occult history. I became interested in this because of this idea of book ownership and coveting knowledge and the ideology behind collecting occult text in an almost ironic possession and what we do to protect that knowledge and to the objects. So I got it started. This is one of the first books I sold at a book fair or in my book trade career here. And it tells an interesting story as it's my first foray into occult text and provenance as a narrative. This book was owned by and in the library of James Wickersham, who was the district judge for Alaska, delegate to the Congress in 1917. He was a diehard politician, but also a mountaineer, and he made the first record attempt to climb Mount Denali, although failing due to the impassable mountain face, later known as the Wickersham Wall. He also authored a book called Whence Came the American Indians, a study in comparative ethnology, compiling anthropological observations of local tribal customs, referencing early indigenous peoples' observations of astrology, divination, and even witchcraft. It allowed this book, because of the ownership, allowed some discovery beyond just the content of the book, as ownership and production became a focal point of how a book as an object presents a compelling occult identity in itself. The other thing that got me kind of hyped about this was I gave a talk a couple of years ago at a book conference, esoteric book conference, on esoteric book plates. And it got me thinking about identity for esoteric printers and esoteric publishers. We talk a lot about unique identifiers and relationship designators in the information science and the metadata world. But really what it does is to add specificity and recognition to creators and the like. There is very much a comprehensive, unique identity in occult literature and how it fits into the world of esoteric and magical studies. Many occult publishers, like you see here, have branded themselves with magical logos and in product. Even their choices of paper bindings, the materials used, whether it's animal skin, choices of parchment, fonts, ink, selections of artwork, and etc. They're very careful and considerate about aesthetics. The metaphysical structure of an occult book is that it embodies the skeleton and the molding of this body of work. There's also a purpose to elicit a practice in magical text, to absorb the text, so that the person reading the material just doesn't consume the media that they're reading, that they become the media that they're reading. So in lieu of this, what actually is the occult? And in sort of a brief, broad definition, the occult arena, whether it is from a practitioner, research, or documentary view, the field of study itself is rife with issues. Those stem from not just the quote-unquote academy, but the implementation of the occult practice. So let's start with a very traditional dictionary definition of or relating to magic, astrology, or any system claiming use or knowledge or secret knowledge or supernatural powers or agencies. Or it is something beyond the range of ordinary knowledge or understanding. It's mysterious. I tend to like Ayana Saif's description here, definition in Arabic influences on early modern occult philosophy, and you'll get to know that why later. And she says, for the sake of brevity and respecting tangents, put simply, if we deconstruct the occult to rephrase a decolonial definition of the occult, foundationally, the occult is completely based in astrology to harness the natural philosophical need to explain how celestial bodies causally influence terrestrial ones. This is an Arabic-based definition into a modern occult one, albeit Western one, of as above, so below. Celestial bodies serve as signs, sympathies, and correspondence on how the Hermetics decipher those based on their experiences. So it is not just about the content that makes a text of or about the occult. It is if the physical occult is entrenched within those principles. For example, a grimoire, a spell book, is not just a book with magic in it, but it encompasses the metaphysics, the paper, the structure, the imagery, because of its cultural identity, because of the commerce that propels it, and of the ancestors of the creators and the art that it inspires. So let's continue on with the metaphysical for a moment. There's a certain level of reveal here, and generational teaching, and frankly, cultural appropriation. Eastern to Western from that. With that in mind, I really want to illustrate through key texts and imagery to initiate and emulate our efforts as humans to recreate this experience, a reclamation of energy, perhaps, certainly in a literary way, to invoke an act of possession and the ritual of consuming identity and acquisition. In a sense, when we acquire something, we bind ourselves to these books as objects. We do this metaphysically and physically with marks of physical attachments, which produce memory and ownership. There is a certain fetishization that happens with objects, and I'm talking about this in a little bit in terms of cultural appropriation. However, cross-culturally, there is a symbiotic connection between practitioner and or author, creator, and the tangible object. It is integral to the part of performativity, and that's really important, and the identity embellished here. So similia similibus has to do with the process and the metaphor in the creation. In this case, this image of making a cursed tablet. By many accounts, making a mark on something is a redirection of energy and also a possible indication of power, materiality reflecting the content and performance of that object. So if language is essentially a modality of power, a mark is an extension of that magical practice. And in that practice, when we think about binding words with objects, in this case, we recover our own sense of poetic language and expression, ritual, as fundamental constituents of the human experience. One idea behind the occult becoming a ritual expression is the transmission of texts and imagery, but also the transmission of an identity of the creator itself. The occult has imagined, patronized, and more critically marginalized key creators in publication history. The best way for me to do that is to contextualize graphic representations and the book as objects bibliographically rather than linearly talk about occult text. So one of the ways this idea begins with the attachment of incantations to objects in terms of textual and visual marks is some of the earliest forms of incantation, specifically curses with texts, appear in ancient Mediterranean cultures with depictions. These textual objects are verbs of transfer and attachment. In this case, on this particular tablet was an issue, a cursing for stolen property. In Greek, the defixio is closely defined as something to be fixed as a verb, affixed likewise or attached. These tablets were made of lead very crude metal and inscribed with the stylus with text of secret names of those demons and divinations, which were only understood by the magician and the creator who made it, and the communication to the spirits themselves. Formulaic in nature, the tablets feature direct binding utterance, an appeal for supernatural assistance, and the anthology for the intended target of the curse, coupled with symbols and figures of the gods. Then they were deposited near the intended target where they resided, died, or sometimes even worn as an amulet. The fact that these curses were written down in some cases accompanied by oral instruction and transferred to a place of engagement, whether it was a tomb or a water source, shows movement towards humanity's understanding of the universal power of language and posterity. It is in this idea that there is a lasting power of language being attached to the physical, and that gives form to expressive and metaphorical aspects of the human experience, even if in offensive intent. So introduces the idea of the anathema, right? The concept of placing an inanimate object under the protection of a deity, and in this case, under God. While not the original use of curses on objects, it's definitely the first instance of protection for texts, either in handwritten in manuscript form or in the bound codex as texts have evolved. As sacred as the writing itself, books within the church were considered holy vessels. So what better way to place protection by putting them in the book itself? This is representative of some of the ultimate forms of ownership and power dynamics. And here's just a list of a few varying degrees of book curses translated that I have come across, and you can see from the 12th to the 14th century how severe they might be if you were to take stolen property away from a library. To really drive this idea home of sort of object and amulet, I really want to quote Elob Derillo from the British Library. I was very impressed by his talk on Ethiopian amulet objects and recipe books. And he says, occult texts or magical texts are living objects, and it's so true. Materiality is something you might wear. It's transgressive existence as something in the present. And once you place the marks, the sacred objects become holistic. Not only does it just contain magic, but it is magic or sacred to a community of people, that reasons that will exist and survive for generations for people. This idea that possession is permanent as a transfer of power, this is what I'm trying to get at. These types of manuscripts featured help codify cultural identities, but solidify the power and the concept that the structure of the book and how it performs, the paper, what are the elemental components of that paper, whether it's plant or animal, the inks that are being used as ritual products. And predominantly in the Western world, the book plate, as example here, is intrinsically attached to the creator and to the owner. And to note those tracings is of utmost importance. And, you know, who might better know to curse their own books than the granddaddy of the occult, Mr. John Dee. John Dee, as a Renaissance practitioner, a magician, when he was not talking to angels or trying to bail himself out of imprisonment by selling his books, no less, and trying to impress Queen Elizabeth I, accumulated a massive library. He had a cataloger and established one of the most provocative accumulations of occult ownership during the Renaissance. His library itself acts as a social agent, playing a mediatorial role in the politics and reading and writing and the study of magic. Occult ownership and annotation lends itself to the mindset of the occultist and sets a very high precedent. And I'm going to mention Dee very briefly in the terms of the amalgamation of his library and the marginalia in his books, because his research on his well-preserved library of manuscripts from his annotations says something not just about the study of his library catalog, for example, and it there are marks like the one with the purple arrow there, this ladder inscription that he used a lot. He also used the symbol of Jupiter, shorthand for his name. These are literal clues that are attributed to him. And we can thank Andreas Fromenschein, who was his cataloger, and he also worked as a bookseller for the famed Berkman family of printers in the 16th century. So Dee himself created his own identity through these use of symbols. And in this one, his Monas Hieroglyphica, this is basically Dee's cosmogram itself. It appears on this frontispiece. And it is Dee's intent to offer it, the cosmogram, as a mystical object for relative contemplation. But it was also seemingly important and a unique identifier attributed to him. This symbol, his symbol itself, prefaced by his own motto here on the page: "He who does not understand should either be silent or learn." So why is this useful? I'm really only bringing this device up because it is really, for occult scholars, it's really a recognizable moniker, and supports Dee's pursuits of instances of a hermetic language, a higher vision, which he remarked about throughout in his entire library of books, a lot of times in the marginalia. Not only was he a dedicated bibliophile who traveled with his library, he used his books actually as sacred vessels. A lot of times he asked of his books for angelic direction. He was one of the greatest bibliotaphs who was also inflicted with bibliomadness. But one of the reasons why we have this extensive and prolific library, which was heavily annotated, that is more actually pretty fascinating to me as a bibliographer and a cataloger than what he was actually collecting himself. By personalizing the distribution of symbols and in fact his autograph, an energetic transfer of power within his copies for his own reference, at the same time, it's a reason why the provenance became so strong. Not only because he did write his name in things, but there was an intention and subsequent value behind his inscriptions. So much so that the book thief, Nicholas Saunders, who tried to co-opt books out of his library, was unsuccessful in his act of removal of his identity. Erasing name ownership is really a negation of power. It's hiding owners, and it hides creators as well. So when is a name, an autograph and hidden on a flyleaf, when is that appropriate to note, say, in a catalog record? Well, in my opinion, paleography is really the key to explaining blips in time and possibly a way of us to communicate with the dead. It's a bibliographic necromancy. Who did not get the opportunity for redemption, for example? Bibliographic description, the basis of an author, date, and title. We're not just looking at it as what it is sometimes, but we look at books bibliographically as a layer of production, as a collaborative process, from the papermaker to the binder, to the book designer, to the owner. I like to think of it as book archaeology. So book plates and name inscriptions are the illuminations of that production history, of that timeline of archaeology in terms of the printing history and ownership. But again, integral to the structure of the book itself as object and as this collaborative process. When you build that record up and you build that character and the identity for the book as object. There's a strong case to show that book plates, as an example, are social records. There's tons of data captured in imagery and production. There are also a borrowed cache of identities, appropriation of ideas, and essentially occult is a conglomerate of ancient and contemporary thoughts. Yet one underlying idea is that it is really protection and power redistribution. Art representing symbology in the ex libris, in the book plate, is evocation. It's the invocation of protection. And there's definitely a relative element of this transferable power. Especially in the esoteric circles of the occult revival, a lot of times these relationships were forged with book plates between the owner and the artist who forged the book plates heavily. I'm going to be talking about occult as a symbolic art form here. So Althea Giles, a book designer, designed this book plate for Lady Colin Campbell. It's a photogravure, late 19th century, and Lady Campbell, aka Gertrude Elizabeth Blood, ran in art and music circles, with Giles as well, but also with the bad boys of the occult, as you can see here, Aleister Crowley. Both were members, the women, members of the Golden Order of the Golden Dawn with W.B. Yeats. There's an inscription at the bottom of this bookplate, not granted to another, which is very much an allusion to that order of the Golden Dawn, but also to the collecting scope of Campbell herself. This is just an example of a link between artist and collector, and that's evident in these visual cues. There's a lot of cues about collector and a symbiotic relationship between the person and the record of their protection of their property. And a lot of times you see this in Masonic owners, people who were Masons and secret societies, and also in occult authors and magicians, like Kurt Siegelman himself. There's a specificity and a relationship between book and owner, as we will see. Another prominent person I researched in this exploration was a fairly unknown occult artist named Carl Hugo Fretsch, an esoteric graphic designer. He was born in Stuttgart, Germany, studied lithography in the Schreiber Art Institute between 1903 and 1905 in Stuttgart, where he later then moved in 1914 to Slovakia, which was formerly Pressburger. He spent most of his remaining life there, making a living as a painter and a graphic artist. Although he contributed illustrations to the local Pressburger Zeitung newspaper and numerous books, his Ex Libris bookplates designs are really particularly noteworthy and something that I was immediately attracted to in my research. Why? Well, because they're an infusion of composition interpretation and an example of bookplates to exist as art identity themselves. Even though they're reproduced in replication with the intention of ownership, their art as art, they act alone. Despite the mystery behind Fretsch himself, he was really enlightened by the esoteric, and it's really a mystery of design in his creations. And this is one of my favorite book plates. I'm assuming this was for a family member, someone that he designed this for. There's really no evidence of his personal occult activity. He was definitely influenced by the history of his time. Unfortunately, he died on July 27, 1945, while trying to escape a camp for displaced Germans, and remains fairly unknown in the occult art world. As a comparison, Austin Osman Spare, well-known magician, occult playboy, among other things, and artist. These book plates I'm going to show you were designed between 1904 and 1945. And so we can only surmise here about him, but another magical scholar and magician, Kenneth Grant, really puts into perspectives about Spare's sigils and his artwork, his visualizations. And he says, sorcery is a deliberate act of causing metamorphosis by the employment of elementals. It forges a link between the powers of mental nature, i.e. the astral plane between spiritual and physical realms, or the ether, the astrals of great trees and of animals of every kind. Will is our medium, belief is the vehicle, and the desire is the force combining with that elemental. Cryptograms are our talismans and our protectors. So he was pretty interesting, literally by his use of magic and didactic ritual. He empowered his bookplates with his magical projections. He would invoke a ritual and then do automatic drawings. And so he reproduced bookplates in this methodology. This is the last bookplate that he designed, being in 1945 for a friend of his who's a journalist, Dennis Bardens. And interestingly enough, Spare around this time lost use of his arms for a while in 1945. So it's an interesting morbid personification that he's really projecting here. And it's really unusual, but not out of the ordinary for a magician like Spare. But it's this element of confrontation. He's really invoked a particular trait about his own identity, however self-absorbed that he was as a magician, and infused it graphically into the design. This is something different than we might see in mass commercialization of the bookplate, which is normally emphasizes the collector. Spare has really infused his own likeness here magically. His work illustrates an aggressive fusion of magic and design. What's also beginning to form is a narrative about ownership and symbolic mark. I like to think that these book plates represent a transferable mark analogous to the physical person, kind of like this bibliotalisman, whether that's intentional or not. Like Spare's work, artist Pamela Coleman Smith herself referred to her visual renderings as melodious hieroglyphics and considered that definition to be a synesthetic transmission of both sight and sound. She herself believed she had synesthesia. She wrote that she could hear and see sound. She could hear color and see sound. Because of that, her artwork is exceptional. Example of tarot on the right here and a book plate on the left that she did not design, but you can see the influence there. There's something conventional beyond the conventional visualization and linked, quote, for her, the desire to believe, these two, that desire and actual belief. Regardless of what Smith evolved to think about her art, it had a profound effect on later occult revival and trends in Art Nouveau styles to the 1960s modern aesthetics. Again, all her tarot designs were intentional and in some cases allude to the provocative nature of art as identity. Her work, although not recognized till much later, she was early 20th century mostly, was influenced on book plates because it exhibited the same kind of energy as the tarot, as an aspect of design. She valued a harmonic relationship of principles in her work for composition: symmetry, subordination, opposition, transition, repetition, which led to a lot of emotional harmony within her work. Another example of bookplate and tarot, her work subconsciously, from her own words, venerated a sense of simplicity in the design and summarized the advice to, quote, "Fine eyes within, look for the door into the unknown country." So with that in mind, Smith, still to this day, her design work is really slow to reveal and to cite, definitely taking advantage of the public domain. It took some 60 years later for her tarot work, to have her name actually printed on the tarot cards, and also for her art and design. There's a lot of imitation of Pamela Coleman Smith out there in product, but there's not a lot of attribution in terms of, I see a lot of records without bibliographic description, and in the case of this from the 1960s is a playbill for the musical Hair, which is completely a reworking and imitation of the Lover's card from her tarot deck. Likewise, in the Tarot of the Bohemians, similarly as a reference for her design, her as a designer, her tarot work is multifaceted for the publishing industry. Yet again, is unattributed on first editions, especially like this one, subsequently into the contemporary age, like I said, in catalog records as relationship designators. So Pamela Coleman Smith, book designer. It's also very underappreciated, unaccredited, and it's reproduced as homage. On the cover of this is a blind stamp of the Wheel of Fortune tarot, but there's no attribution in the actual book. Occult as homage is particularly problematic, specifically how its effect on indigenous identities. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about imposter syndrome and that. One of the best examples of this, of cultural homage and cultural plagiarism, is the publishing empire of Laurent William de Lawrence, aka L.W. de Lawrence, who is a powerhouse in the occult publishing world, established in Chicago. He obsessed his image, not unlike a lot of magicians, quote unquote, at the time, with Orientalism, which is based on blatant racism and appropriation. But he became pretty noteworthy on his ability to reproduce texts. I mean, he's the father of the occult public domain, with a great level of scrutiny from real occultists, however, because of his pirated editions. I think it's fair to say he had a huge influence on parlor and leisure society occultism, leisure reading, despite him being a charlatan. He was famous for doing this, just basically pasting over a label of either a change of design in the publishing source and dates and things like that, and actually author names. He plagiarized, for one, A.E. White and Samuel Liddell McGregor's tarot text, for example. But it's sort of a fascinating look about imposter syndrome and the dissemination and production of texts. There's a wonderful bibliographic catalog actually for his DeLawrence company, and I think it's a great resource for catalogers, collectors, and booksellers because it's a lesson in accuracy. And this, again, this book, Archaeology to Piece Together Publication Dates and Edition Statements. Again, a lot of his publications did not list, they listed a copyright date, but they would not list a publication date. So there's variance in publishing, and a lot of times we can tell them apart by example, cloth color, extent and size, and things like that, as these different titles made their different printing debuts. Likewise, the famous 6th and 7th Book of Moses, or for short, Book of Moses, this magical handbook is a combination of biblical apocrypha, Hermetic, Hebrew Hermeticism, and it's basically an esoteric grimoire, a spell book. But the text had the ability to sort of navigate through that and morph through many traditions of Afro-Caribbean to folk magic and root work of the Pennsylvanian Dutch even, and sympathetic magic. But their design, to a degree, is a reflection of their commodification, how many times these were reproduced. They kept getting published time and time again in various iterations, and a lot of times DeLawrence was the source of that, although is not necessarily imprinted that in your title page or any kind of bibliographic area. But I want to take note of that typography there on the covers for these, because that gives you a lot of clues about when these were published. Not unique, but much of the Western occult canon is a regurgitation of Arabic and African names, source, science, and customs. It also, there's a difficulty with attribution here, similarly to the Petit Albert, the Albert Magnus grimoires, and also Raymond Lull, who gets a lot of false attribution and difficulty with that as a cataloger. I grapple with those descriptions sometimes, those name authorities, which is why context is so important, and acknowledging some aspect of book design, that's super important. So in dating these, I'll go back to this because I really love these slab serif typefaces on this. There's a real wealth of book design with these, and also the binding designs, because they were produced so cheaply during this time period of the early 20th century into the 1930s or even 40s, but it's very hard to distinguish between editions. Similarly, the Libro de Cipriano, the occult text that has very much evolved into pulp literature. It's much of a fantastic element of the novella. The original Portuguese text is a combination of the writing of Saint Cyprian of Antioch, again, another falsely attributed author. It includes a list of various mancies, i.e. necromancy, pyromancy, divinations, astrology. It's a dark arts primer is what it is. Although championed not just by Western occult people, but by followers of Afro-Caribbean traditions mixed with Iberian beliefs. It's almost actually a occult light or folk Catholic theology in a sense. And you can see here the progression of the design. Like the books of the Book of Moses, we start to see identifications through the additions of colors, fonts, pictorial narratives here with the frontispiece, and this emulates the changing of the time between the quality of the paper and actually the attributions. The various imprints in Spanish rather than Portuguese are attributed to the monk Jonas Seferino. These were primarily published in Mexico, Spain, and other parts of Latin America. What these do, though, is they recognize the importance of commerce in Latin America, Spanish and Portuguese-speaking communities and countries, and that the book is validated as a sacred object, and has produced a formidable publishing history for these. Later editions added in a broader ritual element of magic, like a spell book, to become almost newsstand magazine staples. You could go to a newsstand and pick one of these up for very cheaply. And they're a basis for much of this sort of modern contemporary curandismo and brujeria of Mexico the magic of Mexican healers. The occult in Latin American countries is culturally immersive, as the magic itself is inherent and integral to indigenous communities. Which is one of the reasons why I want to talk about the importance of indigenous materiality and identity, specifically with the Papel Amate Codex. The Nahuatl people of Mexica, Mexico, use their indigenous terms for the Amate paper, which is ahmat, for the bioregional tree. The bark of that tree, specifically, it was a ficus tree, a fig tree, yonote, a nettle tree, or the morel, the mulberry tree, for the bark to create this paper. Content-wise, these Mesoamerican indigenous codex are roadmaps. They're visual language. The leporello construction of them, the accordion fold, represents a ladder, and it resembles a ladder, and that represents a bridge between the creator and the physical forms in the earth. This is a metaphysical relationship between material and the text or and the image. And I really love this quote here, this translation quote about specifically about the inks and the wisdom that was produced in these codex. In the 20th century, we see this idea reproduced in the work of Alfonso Garcia Tejes, who reiterated the production of the Amate paper book, but it was not lost, okay? Scholars say, oh, this production of these books was lost in time, perhaps to the Western gaze, but the Otame people continue the process of making Amate and have so. My last slide included 2 links to the production of this paper, and it's really important to watch this because these holistically document the ritual and the healing magic by the curanderos and every process of the construction of these, including the beating of the paper, the motion of the paper cutting for the deity paper cuts, and the fiber of the plant is integral to the structure. Amate is used as a fabric too for clothing like tapas, and really recreates a resource of commerce for the community in San Pablito, which is where Garcia Tejes is from. These books, quote, are designed to control a pantheon of spirits that are believed to have a great influence on human affairs. The core of them feature any ritual that is a sacrificial offering to the spirits. The Papel Amate books are of their own cosmology. The process of their creation and the textual and pictorial evidence is recorded on their leaves. In the pre-Hispanic, pre-colonial era, these codex were and continue to be intrinsic objects of health and symbiotic with their construction with the landscape of the plants. Colonizers of Europe dismissed them and saw them through the lens of witchcraft and magic for cursing or malignant purposes rather than healing purposes. This is a edition statement at the end of one of Garcia Tejes' titles, and it's a colophon, but it's also a type of anathema because he states that not only is this first edition, but he says that it is forbidden to copy this manuscript as a book outside of the curandero practice. Why? Because it is not intended for anyone else but within the community. So it's not supposed to be reproduced by anyone outside of this indigenous community. And I think that this is kind of an example of something that could be noted, especially in if you were creating a bibliographic record. I think this is important to note that. So we're going to get technical here for a moment. This is my cataloger side speaking at the moment. This is the authority record for Alfonso Garcia Tejes and for his personal name. This is an example of something to practice in this for me to enhance this record that desperately needs it because of the history and importance of his work to indigenous manufacturing, to history of the codex in Mexico. I think that this is something I'm going to talk about later of what we can do, but this is an example of what we can do is we need to enhance authorities like these. The other thing I think is important to note, this is a partial of a record for one of his books. I really love this because they've included in the summary note in the 520 for non-cataloger folks outside of OCLC. This is where you would summarize and describe the book itself, kind of like a contents note of what it is, what it means, and what the context of it is. And they've included it as a bookseller's note. And I think this is really cool to see that sort of symbiotic relationship here. The other thing that is great about this is it's the 650s, which are the subject headings, the subjects, and that I've identified the indigenous sovereign indigenous community. So, and it's been broken down and faceted between what it is. It's rites and ceremonies. It's also medicine. It's also religion. There's a lot of geographics, subject geographics here as well. I think that's really important. One thing that I would add to these, and this gets really technical, is I feel, as I've said before, that the construction of these is very important to the integralness of these. And I would include genre terms, which these 655s at the bottom, to the actual construction of what they are, what their construction is, because I think that that is very critical in examining and also recognizing this cultural identity for him. So let's also, before I move on, I just want to say one more thing about Garcia Tellez, and that is what's important to note about him is that his family did copy these texts. Let me actually go back. These are community copies. They're community commerce as it propelled the mate paper production into another level of commerce. So there's a lot of community ownership here with these books, but I think it reinforces a colonial idea. There's a lot of colonial ideas to see these manuscripts as plagiarized. But in order to desettle this, as an example of an occult text, the Amate Ritual Codex should be seen as collective wisdom with a representation of space and time that doesn't reflect a hierarchy necessarily and ownership. Quite different than what I have talked about in terms of sort of provenance with book plates and value and monetary value and things like that. So as an occultist, to identify as an occultist or a magician or a witch in certain countries under certain laws is punishable by death. The identity of, so here I'm going to get into more of occult identities for folks of color and indigenous people. And to identify as a witch, magician, and occultist can also be seen as a point of privilege, certainly for certain communities. The image of a witch is often, or the identification of witchcraft is and has been vilified, but it's also been very romanticized and celebrated, and thus understandably reasons why someone might want to disguise their association, to disguise their identities, and often be seen as other. Again, to reiterate this idea of other, too often indigenous communities are viewed with a magical lens, ethnographically, as other enough, so that their culture has been absorbed into Western ideas either purposefully or unintentionally. And this gets to this idea of indigenous and African appropriation. It's because of this that BIPOC, which is an acronym for Black, Indigenous Persons of Color, cultural influence on the occult is very much borrowed, but there's not enough context referencing a lot of times when we talk about scholarship for this. There's a lot of hidden occult representation and a lot of appropriation because of this ethnographical bias. It's, for example, how do we see, how is Tituba from 17th century Salem witch trials been seen? How has she been fetishized and through this lens of witchcraft, her image from these years in scholarship? Are Black identities and magic always assumed to be coming from a place of exotic practice? Too often is recorded as such, and Black and Indigenous voice are assimilated into white stereotypical narratives about occult history. I would say, though, the work here of Hagen von Tullian is exceptional, but you can see the extent of the work now knowing about paper cuts of Mexico and also Haitian Bebe imagery is very much immersed into his work. He does talk about that, but it's one of these ideas that when you talk about collection development, these are things that you can bring up contextually if you're doing a lot of instruction work within your library, for example. So on this idea, Black voices exist in the occult, and especially in spiritualism, as the occult narrative and in secret societies. There's two examples here. Rebecca Cox Jackson, who's a 19th century Shaker spiritualist who was also a seer and a healer. Loretta Williams, a faculty at University of Missouri, noted is also the first Black faculty, female faculty at that college. And so these are kind of examples that don't really get talked about in the sort of the form of the occult history, and it's something to think about, and again, in terms of collection development, context cataloging, and personal collecting. Yet, when speaking about this influence and singularity, Pascal Beverly Randolph is the most universal 19th century African American, born free spiritualist, occult scholar, magical practitioner, naturopathic doctor, founder of the American Rosicrucian Order, publisher, book design. I could go on. I could do a whole presentation just about, I'm calling him PBR. It's my affectionate term for him. We see his emblem here. We see this motto. A lot of occult scholars and collectors know this model of Try in his designs. He also used an Ouroboros symbol, which is the snake eating its own tail, to emulate this Rosicrucian idea of the supremacy of the will. It's a rejection of failure and a practice of his own will. So Randolph, as a clairvoyant, a seer, and a scryer, but also as a radical sex magician. And this is where a lot of white scholars get really uncomfortable here, and in contemporaries, certainly at the time, that he talked about sexuality and magic in terms of a nuptive moment. And so between male and female. So whether you agree with him or not, on a certain level, a lot of his language has been construed as misogynistic, or his interpretations of his actions, he did champion women's rights. But he often himself struggled with his own Black identity, where he was from, where his ancestral roots. So he traveled a lot. In fact, he did travel to Africa. And we see this here in this sort of emulation of Egyptian occultism. And despite his plethora of publications, he was sort of virtually dismissed in his time. The other thing, here's an image of him. The other thing that is another aspect to this, as far as attribution and his acknowledgments to the occult world, was his wife, actually. His first wife at the time was Mary Jane Randolph. As a contributor and a publisher, and a lot of his publications, she is the attributed publisher, author, and apparently through some of the scholarship I have read, had wrote a lot of medicinal works on women's health and the like, but she's virtually unrepresented in an authority sense in a catalog. And so this is sort of an example of what I'm talking about, as far as how do we expand on the lineage of authority work for people. And again, her image, there's not a lot written about her, but again, her image is sort of this fetishized image of this exotic image of a woman of color at the time. And so she's sort of lost in time as a potential contributor for this age. Here's, again, we're back to the technical. This is PBR's authority record, and it's pretty good. And I want to point out a few things about it that are great. The first thing is that the citations here, someone very much thoroughly researched and used a lot of great citations for this from the African American National Bibliography and Oxford American Studies Center database. Something else really cool about him is that he wrote as a medium, so he has a name authority as an author, as a spirit. So that actually is controlled vocabulary as well. So it's sort of interesting that he has an authority for his spirit too. And so the one thing, my biggest critique about this, though, is, and this comes back to this association, is his work as a publisher and as a contributor and as a printer. There's not a lot of authority for that for him in cataloging. And so I would like to see more of that in the context of describing him, because his publication work was so prolific. So the greater question is, who are Black, Indigenous, people of color occultists? in my view, occult scholarship in embracing under-recognized communities and collection development needs to reconstruct this through structural, metodological, pedagogical, and for generational means. There's a lot to be discovered, there's a lot to be collected, and there's a lot to be celebrated in contemporary voice as well. For example, folks here, whether it's Rollo Ahmed, who was a British Egyptian occultist who wrote this one book here that I could find, The Black Art. Harriet Edie Wilson, another 19th century spiritualist and a medium, and also more contemporary, the work of Sylvia B. Davidson, who writes on mental health and the relationships between the occult. But actually, you know, zines are these contemporary evidence of the work that's being done now to uplift and enlighten and recognize Black voices, whether it's pop culture serials or in the format of zines. And this is something that we need to identify in occult narratives that really dismantle a hierarchy of how occult history and occult evolution has sort of gone from this point. It remains to be seen that the field itself, occult scholarship, has issues with visibility, representation, and white privilege. There could be a lot of interdisciplinary scholarship, including metaphors, contexts of imagery, and social and cultural values. A scholarship in the contemporary sense should inform how we view the evolution of the codex, but also textual documentation and publishing. Fundamentally, it is how we need to view and insurrect continuing relevant contemporary practices, but also evolve and entrench them in the present. There's a slew of radical approaches to contextualizing history, even established ones, but most of theories can be revised and contested. It is a culture of flux, and when appropriate, informs much about the importance of the resiliency of occult textuality. So I want to wrap up. Lastly, let's talk about some applications here. What are you doing, you know, in the context of this as possibly librarians, as possibly administrators, as catalogers and collectors in the context of occult and magic? What am I doing? Well, this is what I suggest. If you want to really become a bibliophilic accomplice, you need to survey your collections and look at your inventory, because you need to see the work. We actually need to see what you have and see what you need to collect, what you need to write about, what you need to promote, perhaps signaling in terms of social media, and stop examining your guilt so much. Oh, we haven't collected in this area. We feel so guilty. You know, it's like, start now. You need to go further than that. Don't just collaborate, reciprocate, back the work, advocate for the work. And that could be in the intellectual reparations. If you're just having someone translate something, pay them. If they're, for example, if you're having someone translate something from Spanish to English, pay people appropriately, and that goes beyond advocacy in your citations and your catalog records. But also in the institutional context, we talk a lot about allyship, and there's a lot of rhetoric of patting ourselves on the back, talking about how to support diversity in terms of recognizing work, but there is so much work to do. We need to do the work. We need to invest extra time, and that could be inviting collaborations with Black scholars, Indigenous scholars on your works. In terms of ALA, and here's a abstract listed here, ALA has been working on genre term demographics to recognize African-American authors to catalog records. So that's being worked on too. This is in the MARC field of 386. And like the abstract mentions, this is appropriate depending on your institution and your collections. There's also similar work being done to address gender and gender identifications. It's about visibility and aggregation and that recognition. So I think for catalogers, in addition to those local practices on cataloging work, we can look in our collections and see who needs to have more summary work done in the note field, who needs to have name recognitions and enhancements of catalog records. I'm actually doing this right now for some African-American poetry. Booksellers, we have the time to look at authors and to look at authors of color and do the citation work. And if you're writing in the context of occult Black history, do not limit to just slave narratives here. The BIPOC experience is right now as well. So if you're looking to work with relationships between librarians, let's look at faculty as well, look at the coursework that's being done, and what are the student needs as well within these institutions, and how might we be able to sort of uncover some of these identities within the occult that haven't really been expanded on. So, like I said, there's 2 links here at the bottom. I suggest that you watch them about Otome manuscripts and the making of them. One of them is in Spanish. But also, lastly, I would like to say that part of the honorarium for this fund, I would like to go to support the Museum of African American History, the Stone Book Award specifically, to possibly see some more scholarship in Americana occult history in particular. My email is at the bottom here, and I really appreciate everyone sticking around for this, and I hope that you find it useful and engaging, and let's continue the conversation. Thank you.
Hi.